So good morning. My name is Emily Keys, and I'm a graduate student here in the History Department at Carleton University. Today I'm interviewing David Dean, who is a professor of history at Carleton and a co-director of the Carleton Center for Public History. As well as early modern British history, he teaches and researches on museums and public memory and on representations of the past in theater, film, and other media. From 2006 until 2012, he was company historian to Canada's English Theatre Company, and he is an advisor and collaborator with Ottawa's Workers' History Museum. David organized this year's Shannon Lecture Series on performing history, restaging the past. So David, I'd like to begin by asking, why did you choose performing history as the theme for the Shannon Lectures?
Well, the Shannon Lectures are funded by an anonymous donor, and the idea behind them is that they introduce the public to sort of some of the latest trends in historical research, historical thinking, historical writing. And so we've had a series on the senses in history, another one on animals in history. And I chose this year's theme, Performing History, Restaging the Past, to reflect my interest as a public historian in non-traditional ways in which historians and others perform the past, represent the past in different ways. So, for example, in film, in video games, in graphic novels, in exhibits, these are ways of representing the past that aren't to do with the traditional forms that historians write in. We write articles, we write lectures, we also write books. And so I wanted to bring a wider attention to those new forms, those somewhat challenging, non-traditional forms of representing the past.
You mentioned public history, which might be an unfamiliar term to some. Can you explain what this means?
Yeah. Public history is a very difficult thing to answer very quickly. Public history is really about the public before the history. So it's really about how the public gets a sense of history, how it gets a sense of the past. And in other words, it's about the ways in which the past is represented to the public, or I'd say actually publics. So feature films, graphic novels, as I said, exhibits, that sort of thing. But it's also about the making of those histories. So it's about who's representing the past, who's choosing the ways in which the past is represented, what stories they're telling, how they're telling those stories, and the various media that they choose to tell those stories in, and what implications that has. And as that suggests, what really makes public history different from history, traditional history, if you like, is a sense of collaboration with others. Those ways of representing the past are usually performed collaboratively, but also we pay a huge amount of attention to audience, or maybe I should say the audiences of history. So we're very interested in, public historians are very interested in sharing authority with publics in their making of the past, and in paying attention to audiences in the way we perform our histories. So it's really those three aspects. It's about historical representation, it's about the making of those representations, and it's also about how people receive those representations and how they're going to influence those representations.
Great. So you've worked with theater directors, actors, filmmakers, and museum curators. How did these experiences change how you think about history and historians?
It's changed a lot. I've started to move away from just writing about history to thinking about how I might perform history. Collaborating with other people is a humbling experience, because you realize that you're bringing a certain authority to the table as a historian, but the people that you're sharing that authority with have their own perspectives and their own expertise, and you have to negotiate and you have to make adjustments, and it's a lesson in humility in a way. It's also a lesson in how we need, as historians, to think about things a little differently in our writing and our writing and our lecturing and whatever way we're choosing to express the past in, digitally or whatever, because we need to think about audiences. And so I found this in a couple of ways. So for example, when I was working on museum exhibits, you know, as a historian, I'm really interested in the content of the 60-word panel, and how am I going to choose those 60 words, and what image might I have on the side that the visitor might see, which images out of the 30 I might have at my disposal. And I'll agonize over those words, as we all do as historians, right? And then you're collaborating with people who say, well, yeah, that's important, sort of. Well, it's very important, they say, but what's also important is how the audience might move through the exhibit to see those things that you're agonizing about. So if there's a space where the audience, the visitor might just flow past the panel in the photograph, for example, or the visual that you've chosen, if they're just going to walk by, I might choose a different visual than if the designer has found a way of actually forcing them, because they have to turn a corner, to stop and look at something more for a little longer. I might choose a different photograph, I might choose different words, and that changes the way I'm actually thinking about what I'm presenting to the public, thinking through audiences and thinking about how they move through things. And when I was working in the theatre, that was very, very important to me, because it was a way of bringing history alive on stage, and thinking about, you know, historians are really good. We're really good at acknowledging the problems of our sources and wrestling with different interpretations of sources. And we're very good at analyzing and proposing those different interpretations. But sometimes there's gaps in the archive, and we have to some extent, we use our imagination to tell those stories, and to have actors embody that was really quite important. And to see those possibilities brought to life really helped me think through more strategically about myself as a writer, and how do I try and create that experience on the page. So I think it's deepened some of those subjectivities that sometimes we're trained as historians to think that we're objective, and we have to remove those subjectivities. Working collaboratively with people, recognizing the importance of audience, and that audience sharing authority with audiences, because we're so concerned with how the audience will experience the past that we're representing, really has helped me think through how I might capture that on the page once I get away from these non-traditional forms of representation.
One theme that comes up in your writing is a tension between historical truth and historical imagination. Can you talk a little bit more about this?
Yeah, it's been a real struggle. It's been a wonderful experience to try and negotiate these things, and a bit of a shock too, to be honest. You know, we are trained, as I said, to be objective with our sources, and we know that our sources are partial, and we know that they're problematic, and they've lasted for certain reasons, and they're about power and authority and so on. But in the end, when we address the gaps in the archives, we are forced to use our imagination, but we try and do it with pretty strong control of the sources that we know. It's quite shocking to see that made visible on stage, or in some form of reenactment, or through a living history interpreter, and or in a film. And I find that at times we had to, particularly the work in the theatre, for example, we had to surrender a desire for historical truth in terms of being an accurate representation of the sources. Sometimes we had to move things about, to change things, to actually, in some ways, capture greater authenticity for the audience to experience. And that's a challenging thing for a historian, to think that you have to negotiate perhaps between accuracy and authenticity. So, you know, I've published a little while ago an article on Kapoor's Elizabeth I, the first film, and it's very historically inaccurate, and historians have had a lot of fun criticizing it and pointing those out. But I argue that when you actually look at the some aspects of the film, and I was looking at the Elizabethan settlement sequence, when you look at that as as a film representation. So you acknowledge that there's going to be compressions of time. You acknowledge that they've got to get something that lasted for months down to about less than a couple of minutes. And you have to acknowledge that it's a filmic language, it's film narration, it's about mise en scène, it's about montage, it's about making a film, it's not about writing a book. Once you analyze it in those terms, then there were moments where actually I think Kapoor captured something very essential about what it was like to be a young woman propelled into an incredible position of power at a very, very dangerous time. And recently I've been working on reflecting on our production of King Lear at the National Arts Centre, which was a groundbreaking production, the first all-Aboriginal acting company performing Shakespeare on the national stage. And they did an extraordinary job and changed my understanding of King Lear through their acting and the whole production. And I found myself thinking at times, you know, we had to actually deviate from Shakespeare's script. We had to deliberately be inaccurate to capture something authentic about the context in which we were putting the play, and also the context in which we were putting the play at the time, which was the early 17th century, but also our own present, our own context, because the past was speaking to our own present at a very volatile time, a very important time in settler Aboriginal relations with the Idle No More movement and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and missing and murdered Indigenous women and so on. These were very powerful times, and we're performing it on unceded territory in the center of the nation's capital. So to be authentic to our time, to be authentic to the historical period, but also to be somewhat authentic to Shakespeare's text required us to be somewhat inaccurate in terms of reproducing that text. And so that negotiation, on the one hand, between accuracy and authenticity is about a larger issue, about our negotiations between our desire to capture historical truth from what we know about the past, but also our realization that there are gaps in that story and we have to use our imagination. So embracing our subjectivities when we use our imagination to really play along with the fictions that are in our fact-making is really an extraordinary thing and a very challenging thing, and then somewhat, I guess, contentious thing to be suggesting as an academic historian or as a public historian. But it's that experience of being an academic historian, working within the field of public history, working collaboratively, surrendering authority, realizing that actors can represent the past just as effectively, but in a different way than how I represent the past in my writing, and thinking about audiences is being quite transformative, yeah.
So would you say that the lecture series is about this relationship between history on the one hand and performance on the other?
Yeah, I think the whole thing is about that, and it was a challenge choosing who was going to come and what they would speak about. And I wanted to get a balance, or not a balance, that's not the right word, but I wanted to get a mixture of people who had some academic training, might have been an academic or are an academic historian, might have had some training as undergraduates, or had no training at all, formal training in history, but were deeply committed to representing the past. And so for public historians, those people are historians. And so we've got people coming who are specialists in theater, specialists in film, specialists in video games, specialists in reenactment. So I think it's going to be a very, very exciting series for that, and I think it's going to speak to a lot more than what I've just spoken about today, but I think it's going to speak about the relation between fact and fiction. I think that's going to come up time and time again, and how we use our imagination is going to come up. I think how we think about audience and what that means for why we're doing what we're doing and how we're doing what we're doing. Also the ways in which the media we choose to work in have a huge effect. I mentioned the constraints that Kapoor had with film, for example, or we have the same thing in theater, trying to get theater down to a couple of hours, right? But when you're making a video game, how do you create that balance between entertainment on the one hand and historical knowledge on the other. If you're producing something like a play where you're resituating it in space and time, then what's gained in that process, what's lost in that process. So we're going to be exploring all of those things in a lot more depth, and I hope by the end of the series we'll have raised a huge number of questions. I think we'll have learned a massive amount, and we'll have learned from people who are both academics and practitioners. So we have Lisa Peschel, who's a theatre scholar with historical background, talking about her re-examination, or discovery, actually, incredible discovery of scripts and cabarets and performances from the Terezin concentration camps. We have, that's at the start of the series, we have Maxime Durand from Montreal, who's coming to speak about his work as a historian on Assassin's Creed. Bruno Ramirez, who is a historian who began writing books and then turned to making documentary film, and then finally to feature film about Italian immigrants in Canada and their experience. And I know that from his writing, he's very engaged with the fiction in our writing, in our history writing, and how we tell truth when we're having to use our imagination to fill those gaps. You know, we have Vanessa Agnew, who's one of the world's leading historians on reenactment, and she'll be talking about reenacting difficult stories like Holocaust stories and genocide, and how we portray those, represent those effectively for audiences. And finally, we have Peter Hinton, who is the director of the English National Theatre, who I worked with for many years, and he'll be talking about his resituating of Shaw's Pygmalion from the original time in Edwardian England through to the modern present, and struggling with all of those concerns about how audiences are going to react to that. So I think we're going to learn a lot about public history, about performing history, about the relationship between history and performance, and it's going to be a fabulous series, I hope.
Thank you so much for speaking with me today, David.
Okay, thanks.
Good luck.
Yeah, thank you.